Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to participate in the Campus do Mar concept. I think it's a very interesting concept, the international project of Campus do Mar. And I would like to thank all the colleagues that are in the other side of the connection, and of course the technical people that made possible this connection. The only thing I regret is that I was unable to go to Vigo, but I hope I'll be able in the future. So what I'll do today, is to talk a little bit about the fisheries, how we see fisheries today, and how we think climate change will make management more challenging in the near future, with some observations we already have and the projections we can do. And then I will expand a little bit on all the problems we have at building adaptation strategies for the fishing sector, especially dealing with the confounding factors and the limitations the technical limitations we have with models, and finally with a definition of goals for the adaptation plans. That it's an area that has to be still worked. So the global fisheries. This is the typical FAO report picture, the most recent one from the Sofia 2012, and what we see still is the same things we've been hearing for some years now, that for the last 25 years now, over a quarter of a century, the marine catch production has been basically stable, and also the number of fisheries that are in the maximum fully exploited condition has been stable. It's about half of all the fisheries in all the stocks that are assessed by FAO and the member countries are stable. And we can have two lectures from these figures. One is that, of course, it seems to be evident that the marine potential for protein production for the societies has reached a plateau, and that all increases of food from the sea may only come from aquaculture, an activity that is still a big potential for development in Latin America and Africa, and African countries at least. And but the other lecture can be tricky. We can think that because production has been stable for 25 years that we're being successful in the management of global fisheries, because we're sustaining the production in a certain level that we can interpret as the catch potential for the entire world ocean. However, this is easily arguable. We can easily argue against this concept if we go to the regional aspects of the catch of the fishing, and of course, if we analyze the structure of the other half of the fisheries, those that are not fully exploited, but the number of overexploited fisheries is increasing, and the number of potential fisheries is decreasing. So, and also, and especially if we go to the regional aspects of the fisheries, one very pessimistic idea we get from there is that there are cases of management failure in virtually every system in the world ocean, and particularly to worry us in many cases where we have data-rich systems with a lot of scientific expertise and a very long history of research and analysis and data gathering. They still have also problems, so it is even harder for some of the fisheries, that data poor fisheries from less developed countries. So basically the message is that we don't have with all the science we have today, we don't have a single and robust way to manage fisheries in the world. There are some isolated cases of success, but many cases of failure with all different combination of money for research and data gathering and expertise and everything. Part of the problem, I think, is the way we have conceptualized fisheries management, that for most of the cases still, for most of the governments or resource administrators worldwide, it is still the idea of keeping a constant production level of the different stocks, and our management toolbox has been increasing now, not only with the direct management measures like catch control or effort control or closing areas, or gear regulations or seasons, but also including more recently indirect ways to control the fisheries, like incentives and fisheries certification and so forth. But still, the idea is to keep a constant level. Behind all this is still the concept of the maximum sustainable yield that we know it's not possible just like that. We know fisheries and marine organisms and marine populations vary in time. We know that since many years ago, in the late 1800s, Lutham published a paper on the Bluesian herring, describing cycles, natural cycles of around 55 to 60 years. He was already aware that it has related to climate, and of course we have other examples from fisheries that are not, marine organisms that are not fished, like the plankton in the Russell cycle in the English Channel, and we have different evidences from the anthropological sciences to paleoecological and many empirical observations in different parts of the world. And probably the best example of these fluctuations, natural fluctuations, is the one that calls my attention more intensely. That is the small pelagics, particularly the small pelagics from the four main fishing systems in the world, and I'm talking about biomass. That it's California, Humboldt, Venezuela, and Japan systems. They provide over 30% of the total marine fish catch. Particularly in some years, it can be even larger than that. And they have four main properties that I would like to mention that illustrates these natural interactions between climate and fisheries. That it's what I would like to stress at this point. One is a very high abundance. They are the most massive fisheries in the world, particularly the anchovy from Chile-Peru system. Also, the large fluctuations they show, these very large fluctuations of several other orders of magnitude have been documented of course, in the industrial fishery period, but also before that. In the graph there with the boxes, you see the fishery going back several hundred years, when it wasn't an industrial fishery, and showing periods of high and low abundance recorded by people in some way. It's not very quantitative, but it's a very demonstrative example of fluctuations, very large fluctuations. And we have other indicators such as the fish scales, deposits in anoxic sediments, like the ones we have here in the California system, showing fluctuations. There's debate on how much they really reflect the overall abundance of the system, but at least they reveal very large fluctuations in the scale of 40 to 60 years for both sardines and anchovies in at least this system, and there are indications from other systems as well. The other component, and we are moving from the very evident to the more controversial observations in small pelagics, is the species alternation. It's been documented from the fisheries record and also from anthropological evidences that the periods where anchovies abundant, sardine tends to be less abundant, and vice versa. And this happening in all of the systems. There are, however, periods where both species are not abundant or abundant, but these are considered or can be considered as transition periods between the two main basic conditions. And the third component of the small pelagic fluctuations topic, that it's more generally called the regime problem, is the synchrony. This is the more controversial one. In the very early 1990s, a group of people, including Professor Kawasaki from Japan, documented this these fluctuations occurring in at least these four important systems of sardine and anchovy production in the world: California, Japan, Humboldt, and later they included Benguela as well. This has been a matter of a lot of controversy lately because California seems to be out of phase at the moment, but for many years it worked very well, and particularly the relation between Humboldt and Japan, which are the very remote systems, still keeps holding, and they show very similar fluctuations and changes in basically the same time. With all these and many empirical observations and correlations, we know there is a linkage between the environment and the small pelagic fluctuations. The truth is that we still ignore the underlying mechanism that really governs these fluctuations, but we realize there is something in the background. Sometimes we have analyzed temperature, and we know in temperature, in the very low frequency, in the order of 40 to 60 years, there is a signal that correlates very well empirically with the sardine and anchovy periods, and this is still very puzzling for some of us. Of course, if we analyze geographically these fisheries, we know at least for the Eastern Pacific systems, the California and the Humboldt systems, we know these bands where the sardine and anchovy are located are different from the rest of the coast. We know they basically have a different frequency domain than the rest of the coast. In the graph you're seeing power. This is a Fourier transformation from every spot in the coast for sea surface temperature for more than a century. So what we see is the power that you have periods in the top of the graph. So basically we're saying that the California current system is dominated by fluctuations of around 20 years. This is very likely the PDO frequency, and we see the Humboldt current is mostly dominated by the frequency of around 10 years, and very different from the rest of the coast. The very high frequency answer-related fluctuations in the tropics, and low frequency but different from the transition zones in the more temperate areas. When we extract the signal that explains this geographical distribution, say by empirical orthogonal functions, what we see is that in time, this spatial pattern I'm showing, if we see its signal in time, it correlates very well, particularly with the Peruvian anchovy, and of course it's harder with the sardine because it was in moratory since the 50s. So the catch signal in the sardine does not reflect abundance, or at least it was zero for many years because of the moratory. But with the Peruvian anchovy, that it's basically dominated by abundance, the effort is dominated by abundance or response to abundance. the signal is very coherent. So again, the message is we know the climate changes a lot, the biomass and distribution of fish resources, and even when we know that, and we know there's a lot of progress and a lot of knowledge on these fluctuations, we really haven't been able to translate that or include that formally and practically into fisheries management. We've been able to deal a little bit with uncertainty and declare and accept that we don't know what's really going to happen. So we include a risk factor, a precautionary factor in our strategies and in our exploitation strategies, but we haven't been able to incorporate formally the variability. This is basically because we lack understanding. Upon that, more recently we have another challenge, that it's the idea of rules changing due to climate change. We now know that there is, independently from the scientific debate of interpretation of trends or mechanisms or so forth, and independently also from the mediatic debate between believers and deniers and all this stuff, what we know is that there's a clear trend that has been occurring for several years now, that it's changing the rules of the marine ecosystems, how they function, and how we are able to use the marine services and exploit them and manage them. So this is an extra challenge for the management that we are facing today. And in this cartoon, I'm resuming the three largest reasons for concern in the marine environment. We say that atmospheric CO2 is participating in the warming of the planet, including the ocean, and the warming ocean is causing increases in sea level high, extreme events, and its stratification. So the warming and the temperature effect on organisms is by itself of great concern. But also the stratification of the ocean, together with changes in primary production and eutrophication and many other processes, results in the oxygenation of the water column. This is an increase of the hypoxic layer in the ocean. And this, of course, changes the rules for the pelagic ecosystem, changing the volume organisms are able to exploit, changing the access to food, exposing them to different conditions of predation and fisheries, and of course even causing, in many cases, direct physiological impacts. There is also a consequence of a stratification in changes in the primary productivity on the ocean, but the projections and the understanding of this part is much lower than the rest. So I guess the community is still very cautious to really say something about a trend in terms of primary production and the global primary production. On the other hand, the increase in the atmospheric CO2 is also changing the chemistry of the ocean, particularly by reducing the pH and making the waters more acidic, and this having, of course, impacts in many communities, particularly in those calcifiers such as corals or marine mussels. I know you have in your repository of videos, you have an excellent set of talks about these processes, particularly the acidification, so I won't go further in that. These three reasons for concern or processes, together with all the other processes that are linked to them, affect the environment and, of course, the organisms in a direct way, in the physiology of organisms, in their mortality, their performance, including their reproduction, and their movements and their distribution, changing from the organisms to the populations, accumulating these impacts and changing the overall distribution and abundance of populations, some in a greater degree than others, but of course with the potential to change through the changes in populations, the communities, the interactions between components of the communities and the overall ecosystem as indirect impacts. Some of these have been already observed. Many are, most of them are educated guesses that we make based on the knowledge of the species, but some of these changes are have been already observed, especially related to temperature. For example, this paper published in 2010 compiled a series of observations on biomass, on loss of habitat, on the composition and the species richness, biogeographic ranges and phenology, connectivity between populations, and increasing in propensity for change, including diseases. And these are all the one set of examples from that paper where they demonstrate that the phytoplankton biomass and zooplankton biomass is related to temperature, and also the relative proportion of fractions of phytoplankton from phytoplankton to phytoplankton in different regions of the world, and the dynamics of the larvae stage of different organisms, and in the duration, dispersal possibility, and overall survival of the larvae. And of course, most of the marine animals have free larvae stage in their life cycles. Well, the global models today, there are several initiatives of modeling, of translating or taking the climate models to primary production models or productivity models, and from there to fisheries potential. There have been a set of attempts. They all basically agree in their projections of decreased fish productivity, particularly for some areas of the world, the more tropical, where the less developed countries are distributed. Potential modest increase for high latitudes of the overall potential catch fish, and changes, of course, in the community composition, and in some cases, fully local extinction of components of the ecosystems or the communities. These projections from the models are, however, very uncertain if we go as we go to the regional level. And what we need for adaptation strategies, and probably a better name would be adaptive strategies for climate change. We need production scenarios, or some way, or some version of production scenarios of depending on the resource vulnerability, and build from the analysis of population biology and the local signal of climate change from the detection and attribution exercises, and with the climate change scenarios. And I want to be emphatic here. The climate change scenarios are not enough for building the projections, any kind of projections. We need the local signal, because basically the global circulation models are thinking in the global, in the entire world. And when we go to the regional aspects, the rules can change dramatically. What is the problem when building these adaptation strategies, and what are the challenge for adaptation? Is this the next part of the talk? These are the confounding factors, the limitations and the definition of goals. The confounding factors, I'm talking basically, there are of course many possibilities of confounding factors, and again at the local level there probably a totally different set of aspects, but in general the most common or the most important are, first, that fisheries interact with climate variability, and fisheries can alter the rules or the way the marine resources respond to climate variability. In this example provided by Globek people for the Norwegian code, the fishery changes the age and size structure of the population and increases the correlation between the population and the climate signal as the size of the animals is in average decreased. So this is an observation and just one way to remember that fisheries changes the sensitivity of populations to climate change and the communities. A second that sounds very evident or very logical thing, but we tend to forget it, it's again that productivity, temperature, changes, trend, everything is distributed in the ocean in not homogeneous way. So when we take a global signal to analyze our region, we are probably committing a very big mistake. We have the potential to make a huge mistake. In this example I'm showing, we basically analyzed the recent trends analytically, the recent trends for the oceans around Mexico, and what we detected was that very contrasting signals depending on the basin, and for example in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean, we see a clear warming trend, a long-term warming trend, not very intense, but consistent for at least the last 30 to 40 years. Very different to what we see in the Pacific side, particularly in the southern part of the California current, where we see a clear cooling trend for at least the last 15 years, 10 to 15 years. And we have, of course, areas in between where we see basically no trend or transition between the two extreme conditions. And what we learned from this exercise is that we cannot say the same or use the same kind of models and projections of 2 degrees for the Gulf of Mexico and for the Pacific just in this small part of the world. We have to be very cautious of what climate change signal we use to create scenarios of whatever we need. If we extend that, we know also that for other regions, particularly upwelling regions, such as the Humboldt Current, the signal is in the same sense. The trend, the recent trend for the last at least 15 years is a cooling one, not a warming one, as we can learn from the entire world ocean. Upon that heterogeneity, we have a very strong limitation, particularly in some areas of the world, such as the oceans around Mexico, where climate time series are relatively short. In some areas, it's even worse. And we know that an analysis we do right now, if we revisit that in years later, we can have a totally different picture. This particular case is a very illustrative. It was an upwelling signal in the Gulf of California in the early late 90s. We had a very strong signal of changing of the seasonal cycle, of the seasonal amplitude of the upwelling, and when we revisited that 10 years later, we found the trend was basically nothing, and the signal we had was a decadal or interannual, even an interannual oscillation. So another confounding factor is that we tend to analyze systems in a very simplified way. We have to do that in order to model, for example, traffic flows or energy flows in the systems. But we know the rules are very different, and the systems are much more complex than we tend to think. And it's okay to have a simplified ecosystem if we know what we're analyzing. The problem is when we take that model and extend that to make predictions or projections for other purposes, such as impacts of climate change. We know, for example, that for some systems, this is also a slide provided by Globek people from a more polar oceans than the Gulf of California, where we know systems can be in very different stages of trophic flows, basically seen as trophic flows from systems based, for example, in krill or copepods, and changing in time between them, and with that changing completely the rules of the ecosystem and the way it works and responds to climate signals. So, besides the confounding factors, we have very strong modeling limitations. The truth is that general circulation models are able to propose future conditions for different aspects, but we are unable to reproduce, for example, with all models and successfully enough events like ENSO or the interdecadal fluctuations. So the confidence we can have in models for projections of fish fluctuations in the order of several years to decades is very limited. Upon that, this is, for example, a paper by Stenecker in 2010 when they made projections or scenarios of primary productivity based on global circulation and models and emission scenarios models, and what they have in the dots, in the black dots in the map, is areas where the regional models are unable to reproduce what it's seen in satellite in levels higher than 50%. So it's basically a coin toss, and these areas are some of the areas where the greatest catch of the world occurs. So our projections based on these models have to be very taken with a lot of cautious and a lot of care. In areas like Mexico, this is spectral power from the Pacific coast of Mexico. What we see is that if the models are not able to reproduce ENSO signal or PDO signal, and their combination is still, of course, much more difficult and complex, and we are exactly in that band of climate variability, where we have not only trends but also the PDO and the ENSO signals confounded or mixed in that latitude area. So the resulting variability is extremely complex, and models are totally unable at this stage to reproduce what we can see in the records. So what it's needed, we need to give information. We just can't say that models are unable to do something and that the data is limited and time series are too short. We have to say something. My strong message here is that we have to say something without making predictions. Of course, we can work with the scenarios, but we cannot make predictions, and this is something that our politicians and our managers need to be aware of. I've seen a lot of reports lately, or in the last few years, making predictions of different sorts, rain or crop production and things, and these are very dangerous, I think, very dangerous predictions if the manager is not aware of all the uncertainties and problems related to that prediction. We made recently an adaptation plan project for the industrial fisheries in Mexico, and To be honest, we were unable to really use production scenarios because of all the things I previously said. And so we basically restricted the results using a logical framework approach to basically two main goals for the entire country. That it's one is related to increase the understanding of the fluctuations from the government standpoint, with including the capacity to detect changes in the environment, these transits to monitoring systems, large-scale monitoring systems, which we lack. Most of Latin America lacks real formal monitoring systems, and this is very, very dangerous. We are basically unable to detect anything at the local level. And it goes also, the other component was, besides knowledge, the understanding from the industry point of view, for the insurance companies, for the building of technical bodies within the industries that become able to talk to the academy and government and think on risks and levels of risks and think on quotas and everything, including or keeping in mind this, the climate fluctuations and the risks related to climate change, and also to think on the fish exploitation as a risky business, which is. And I will end mentioning that not everything is bad with climate change. From an optimistic point of view, I would say that climate change, it's also bringing huge benefits to the fishery science and fisheries management sector. And this is basically in the sense of increasing conscience among population. We are not responding out of responsibility, but responding out of fear to changes in climate, and adopting or start thinking seriously on adopting sustainable practices of many sorts, including fisheries management and all the practices around fisheries management. So this is a very good consequence. Independently of climate change, we're being cautious, and we're taking actions forced by pressure and more quickly than we would have without a climate change claim. And of course, it includes, as part of this increasing awareness and increasing conscience, the idea of increasing the knowledge and understanding in our case of marine ecosystems. It is particularly, I'm very curious of seeing the consequence of the next IPCC, the fifth assessment report includes for the first time formally a chapter on oceans. So I would like to see, I expect to see a lot of research on marine ecosystems and the impacts of climate change on marine ecosystems increasing dramatically in the upcoming or currently, and that we can detect in the upcoming years. This the red line there is, for example, the number of papers published on climate change, and the green line in the bottom is on marine ecosystems. So as you can see, there's a growing peak, or a peak in papers production just previous to each IPCC report. So the last one that it's occurring in 2014 should increase, of course, the red, but also the green line significantly. And also the monitoring of our oceans. As I said, some areas are, as Europe or the North Atlantic or the Western Pacific, are very well monitored, but for some areas, just such as the tropical and South Pacific, the coastal area especially, are basically not covered by any monitoring devices, mostly. So this increasing in awareness and responsibility includes the setting of ambitious monitoring systems. And I would like to end my talk just by inviting you to visit our institution virtually or physically, where we will be very pleased to host you here. CIBNOR is a research institute in Mexico, in northwest Mexico, that makes research in four main areas, that it's aquaculture, agriculture of arid zones, conservation and environmental planning, and fisheries ecology. And of course we have a postgraduate program and a technological part that tries to link society with the science. So you're very welcome in La Paz whenever you like to come, and I would again like to thank Campus Del Mar and the organizers for letting me participating in this initiative. Thank you. Is that there are cases of management failure in virtually every system in the world ocean, and particularly to worry us in many cases where we have data-rich systems with a lot of scientific expertise and a very long history of research and analysis and data gathering. They still have also problems, so it is even harder for some of the fisheries, that data poor fisheries from less developed countries. So basically the message is that we don't have, with all the science we have today, we don't have a single and robust way to manage fisheries in the world. There are some isolated cases of success, but many cases of failure with all different combination of money for research and data gathering and expertise and everything. Basically stable, and also the number of fisheries that are in the maximum fully exploited condition has been stable. It's about half of all the fisheries in all the stocks that are assessed by FAO and the member countries are stable. So we can have two lectures from these figures. One is that, of course, it seems to be evident that the marine potential for protein production for the societies has reached a plateau, and that all increases of food from the sea may only come from aquaculture, an activity that is still a big potential for development in Latin America and Africa, and African countries at least. And but the other lecture can be three observations we already have and the projections we can do. And then I will expand a little bit on all the problems we have at building adaptation strategies for the fishing sector, especially dealing with the confounding factors and the limitations the technical limitations we have with models, and finally with a definition of goals for the adaptation plans. That it's an area that has to be still worked. So the global fisheries. This is the typical FAO report picture, the most recent one. From the Sophia 2012, and what we see still is the same things we've been hearing for some years now. That for the last 25 years now, over a quarter of a century, the marine catch production has been. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to participate in the Campus Del Mar concept. I think it's a very interesting concept, the international project of Campus Del Mar. And I would like to thank all the colleagues that are in the other side of the connection, and of course the technical people that made possible this connection. The only thing I regret is that I was unable to go to Vigo, but I hope I'll be able in the future. So what I'll do today, is to talk a little bit about the fisheries, how we see fisheries today, and how we think climate change will make management more challenging in the near future. With some of the we can think that because production has been stable for 25 years that we're being successful in the management of global fisheries, because we're sustaining the production in a certain level that we can interpret as the catch potential for the entire world ocean. However, this is easily arguable. We can easily argue against this concept if we go to the regional aspects of the catch of the fishing, and of course, if we analyze the structure of the other half of the fisheries, those that are not fully exploited, but are the number of overexploited fisheries is increasing, and the number of potential fisheries is decreasing. So, and also, and especially if we go to the regional aspects of the fisheries, one very pessimistic idea we get from there